I'm really delighted and overjoyed actually to be talking to my friend and colleague and fellow thinker in the psychoanalytic vein, Danny Cho. And I'm going to talk to him today about his new book, Genius After Psychoanalysis. And it's an amazing book, I think, first of all, and hopefully our conversation over the next however long will shed some light on the book and make some of his theses clear, because I think there are multiple ideas that he's working out in this book, and give you a sense of why, just how exciting it is, I think. So good to see you, Danny, and great to talk to you. And for my first question, I guess, is when I've read this book twice, so my sense when I read it both times is that you're trying to democratize the idea of genius. And I guess my question for you is that a correct inference from what you thought you were doing when you wrote the book? So maybe you can use that as an occasion to kind of talk about what you thought, what your main driving thing behind the book was. And if I'm totally off base, that's fine.
Okay, so first of all, Todd, thank you so much for interviewing me, and thank you to you and Hillary for all the work you did to get the thing published. It's not an understatement to say that it wouldn't have seen the light of day if it hadn't been for your intervention. But I would say it's interesting that you say it that way, because I think that in some ways I'm trying to make genius more accessible, but in other ways I think it is in some ways less accessible, because I link genius to sublimation. And while that means that genius is something that we all have the materials for, the basic components for, insofar as sublimation is related to the drive, and that's something that's just constitutive of human beings as such, sublimation is a particular formation of the drive, and one that Freud thinks is actually quite rare and exceptional when it does occur. It's not something that is a structural part of the drive. It's a certain kind of orientation toward the drive. So in that sense, I think that in some ways, genius is something that's less accessible. So I think that it's very clear to me that all of our notions of genius as like IQ, savants, technology gurus, all of that stuff, that's all way off the mark. That's
so it's very so I am right to think that your book is very anti-biologist in its sense, right? Like you're trying to de-biologize the idea of genius.
Yes,
right?
Correct. Yeah. So genius these days are just seen as like your performance on aptitude tests. And neuroscientists are busy at work, or some neuroscientists are busy at work trying to find where in the brain it is, what parts of the brain develop into what makes someone a genius. Back in the old days, they thought it was like the size of the brain and things like that. Now they think it's, where the MRI shows it. None of that is what I'm saying genius is. That's way off the mark. But yeah, it's not a biological or I would even say not even a psychological category.
It's instead a certain relationship that one has to one's own drive, right? Like that's basically your claim. I find that I have to say, I found it completely. There's few books I read where I have little quarrels here and there, but about genius, like it's one of those few times where I was just completely convinced. Like I just feel like you hit on something where you really got at the. For one thing, I've never liked it when people use the word. Like I find, like, because I always think like, okay, what you're saying is this person is sort of out of the bounds of like normal human subjectivity, and so they're sort of exceptional. And you are saying they're exceptional, but what you're saying is they're not outside the bounds of normal human subjectivity. In fact, this is like especially if you're talking about sublimation, it's a vicissitude of normal human subjectivity, even according to Freud, right?
Yeah, I think maybe actually one way. So this is not in the book, but you're talking about it made me think. One way to think about it is sublimation is maybe the truth of the drive, And what we normally engage in according to the pleasure principle, so that's like the major operating principle that Freud thinks normal human beings typically relate to the drive. In some ways, the pleasure principle is already a defensive mechanism to sublimation. Right. It's a way to try to re-engage the drive into normal, capitalistic, consumerist, comprehensible terms, the terms that we can manage. I can manage this idea of the pleasure principle, right? I can try to limit my exposure to things that stimulate me, and I can spend time, expending stimuli that are accruing inside my body. Sublimation is sort of like what is left over after you give up the pleasure principle.
Well, it's interesting because the way that you even talk about the genius's relationship to the pleasure principle, I think fits into that, right? Because you make this distinction between end pleasure. I think these are neologisms of you, I think, right? Between end pleasure, at least they create a red squiggly line for me when I write on my summary of your book, like end pleasure and for pleasure, right? Like I know Freud says Vorlust. I know that word is a Freudian word.
Yeah, these are actually Freudian terms. Yeah.
Oh, so even end pleasure and Endlust is a Freudian term.
Yeah.
Too. Okay.
Yeah.
So as a single, obviously. So, but it's interesting. Has anyone else before you made end pleasure one word in English, or because I've never seen that.
No, I don't think so. I didn't intentionally do it to try to create neologisms, but I just did it to try to avoid hyphenated words. But I think I
like that. I didn't mean to get sidetracked on this, because my point is the way that what you're saying is this like the genius's revolution of the pleasure principle is tied to this, like most people invested in the pleasure principle are invested in the end pleasure that results, right? And
Absolutely.
the genius is content almost, or accepts, finds gratification in the for pleasure, right? Like that's
correct. Yeah. So one of the basic ways people understand Freud is that like he had like a certain operating idea of what the drive was and what the psyche was, and then 1920 came around and he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he revolutionized his drive theory. And I guess when I see, so end pleasure and for pleasure are terms that he introduces in the 3 essays on the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which is like 1905, I think.
1905, right.
And my claim is actually that there is an extraordinary continuity between 1905 and 1920 through this figure of for pleasure, because if you examine what he describes by for pleasure, that turns out to be the death drive in 1920, at least as far as I see it. So what Freud says is that there's 2 kinds of pleasure. One is, so if you look at people who have sex, they do all these things for the end goal of orgasm. But Freud says along the way, they engage in all these, what he calls preparatory acts, things as simple as like looking at each other, saying things to each other, dressing in certain kinds of clothes. And those things in themselves are pleasurable, right? But at the same time, they increase the tensions in the body that makes end pleasure much more intense. So we're left with this contradictory idea of something being economically productive, which in Freud's normal theory would be considered pain, yet it's experienced as pleasure. And that, to me, seems to be the key to understanding sort of what is going on when people become genius or when people experience genius. It also is key to understanding what happens in the death drive, right? Some kind. And so he actually warns in 3 essays that we should not engage too much in those preparatory acts, or else they have the ability to usurp the end pleasure. And maybe perverts and such like that are people who have traded in for pleasure for end pleasure. And I think that, again, that's sort of like the death drive, right? The death drive has this troubling presence that it can usurp it can usurp the direction of the drive away from pleasure towards this other kind of pleasure in pain, or this kind of thing beyond the pleasure principle.
Right. I mean, and then it's interesting what you just said, because in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, I think in the last paragraph, he says, it seems that it turns out, I think you might even quote this, it turns out that the pleasure principle ultimately serves the death drive, right? Which would support, I mean, that is a change, it seems to me. Like, I think you're right that there is this continuity that I and others tend to minimize maybe. But I think that's a point of a change, because in 3 essays, he thinks that's a danger. And by Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he thinks like, that's just probably the way it is. Right.
Yeah. Actually, even Freud himself, I think, doesn't recognize that there's this continuity. For pleasure is a term that he basically drops. Yeah. It only reappears mostly like in his writing on the joke aesthetics. He talks about there's sort of a for pleasure to the aesthetic product that sort of draws you in. But by and large, it's a term that he doesn't really utilize very much. So I think it's something there that he found maybe too extreme or too something
dangerous even. Yeah. That's really interesting. Does that actually is a good pivot point, because I really wanted, I mean, one of the main things I want to talk to you about is about Leonardo, because he's your main, I think that's your jumping off point for the whole book, right? Is Leonardo and the contemporary. I don't think this critique is still the critique, right? But the contemporary critique of him for abandoning his, I mean, the claim was, you say, he abandoned his artistic genius and got dabbled in science. And your idea is that Freud sees that, no, actually this dabbling in science was an extension. That was the genius. And if he wasn't a genius, he would have kept making beautiful paintings. Such a fascinating way to think of it, because I think I've always succumbed to I was never convinced by Freud until I read your book that this is true. I always thought, oh, it's too bad he kind of turned away. He probably could have had a couple more great paintings in him. So I guess like that is that artistic genius, and then that like that for you is really tied to for pleasure, right? Like that's one of the points that you're making about Leonardo, right?
Yeah. So with Leonardo, and it's right that the whole idea for the book came from when I was reading Leonardo da Vinci, and in that book, he calls Leonardo a universal genius. And, no one really reads that book as a theory of genius, but I kind of thought to myself, if Leonardo is a genius according to Freud, what kind of theory of genius is involved in what's going on in Leonardo? A book that's, famous for all kinds of sorts of errors and
well, isn't it interesting? That's the thing it's most famous for. It's most famous. I think most people who know of Freud's reading of Leonardo know that he mistranslates this term for vulture, right? And then that causes the whole, that I've seen the mother. So it's like Freud's own, it's like for them, it's like for the critics of Freud, it's like a complete synecdoche for the way in which he imposes the Oedipus complex on everything, I think.
Yeah. He's sort of more a reflection of Freud than it is of Leonardo.
Yeah.
It also tries to explain a lot of Leonardo through his latent homosexuality. And, there's a lot of people who take exception to that. And so there's a lot of reasons not to read the book. But I thought myself, why not read the book to see if it's true that he's a genius, what makes him a genius? And so there is this idea that in Leonardo da Vinci is engaged in a project to complete a certain artwork, and yet he engages in these other side ventures that are at first intended to further his understanding of his ability to create an accurate or a realistic painting, color theory, light theory. He's trying to understand how all of these things interact so he can actually produce this artwork. Then all of a sudden, at some point, those side ventures become the ventures themselves. He rarely comes back to the painting, to the lament of all of his colleagues who think that his duty in the world is to be making paintings. And I think that failure to complete, that failure to reach an end goal, the failure to achieve end pleasure, all of those things are the signs of genius, are the locations of genius, right? And that's where you find him producing in the for pleasure, like all these preparatory studies he's engaged in science. Eventually, then he just abandons art altogether just to engage in this scientific speculation. One of the drawings that I discuss in the book is that equation for a hemisected man and woman, which has all these bizarre depictions of the, it's got like a penis with two tubes in it, and a breast that's connected to the uterus, and all these bizarre abnormalities. And I think it's naive to say that Leonardo just didn't know the anatomy of the body. I mean, this guy was like involved in actual dissections, and so he knew the body very well. But what was going on in that drawing, I think, are sort of all of those excesses, those side studies, those things that really are not connected to any kind of end goal, any kind of usability, any kind of utility. And I think those excesses are the expression of genius.
Yeah, that's really, really good, I think. And I just, you use the term the duty, like his colleagues said, you're betraying the duty of genius. And it made me think of, so I don't know if you know this book or not, but this writer Ray Monk wrote a biography. It's probably the best philosophical biography ever written of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the subtitle is the duty of genius. And it made me think, like, I think would you say, I guess my question, it is like the incompletion of Leonardo's project. That's the duty of genius, whereas the colleagues that wanted him to like paint a bunch more paintings in the style of Leonardo, like that would be the betrayal of the duty of genius. And then it made me think, like, isn't it odd that Wittgenstein published one work in his life and left all of this stuff unpublished too? Like even the great philosophical investigations, the great work of the later Wittgenstein, is a posthumous work. And so I wonder, is there something to that? Is there something to like this kind of not completing it? Like that seems to me to fit into your theory, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. I think to add another philosophical pair. So this is something it's not in the book, but something I thought about when I was thinking about these ideas a long time ago. This is like back in graduate school. It's also the difference between Walter Benjamin and Theodore Adorno.
Yeah.
Walter Benjamin, what we have of Benjamin are basically all of these fragments, these non-published, these stray thoughts. Adorno famously thought he was wasting his time on theology. Scholem thought he was wasting his time on Marxism, and I think that, opposed that you have Adorno, who is like a professional philosopher. He wrote tomes, he wrote essays, he was amazingly productive.
Yeah.
So I think, like, absolutely, I think there is something about genius that is not utilitarian. I think that's also why I hesitate to say that I democratize genius, because there's so many of us would just hesitate to want to have that. I think it's more of an ethic, right? It's like something to actually hold true to, because I think a lot of us would shun, at that kind of, a lot of us pathologize our inability to complete things.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, that's such a great, that really is helpful for me, the Adorno Benjamin thing. Cause when I don't know, it was about 15 years ago, their correspondence got published, and I was reading a review of it, and it said, and because Benjamin's, all of his correspondence to Adorno is like, I need some money, Teddy, can you send me? and Adorno's writing these long philosophical letters, and somebody reviews it. He goes, "There's only one philosopher here," and he meant Adorno. But and as you say, that's probably true, right? But no one, I think, who's really thinking about it thinks, who's the thinker you're more drawn to? I mean, okay, there's like Adorno people that are, but most of us feel like Benjamin is a far more compelling thinker. But I have students that are like, we read On the Concept of History, and they're like, what else should I read by him? I really want to dig into a lot of things. I'm like, Well, I mean, there's a couple of things, but it's not, you're going to be disappointed. And I think like the fact that, did he have the final thing finished and then the Nazis took it? I mean, I think like even that question kind of testifies to the genius dimension, right? Like yeah, I think it's such a great example by you.
Maybe one way to say it is like, yeah, there's only one philosopher in those letters, but there's also only one genius in those letters.
Only one genius, yeah.
I mean, it's some of, and that's not to say that these side ventures are uninteresting, right? I think that what's most fascinating in Leonardo are these bizarre drawings of the body. And I think that what Leonardo was trying to do, as far as what I think Freud thought Leonardo was trying to do, was he's using investigation not to accumulate knowledge to sort of plug up all the holes in our, like, I don't know if this is when you're in graduate school, but like in education, they always talk about you do a literature review and then you find the gap in the literature, and then your study fills that gap. And I think that like one mode of inquiry is that kind of university discourse plugging in all the holes in our knowledge. And I think what Leonardo is trying to do to put it in Lacanian terms, he's trying to put a form to the lack in knowledge as such. Like this is in the book, I equate this with in computer science, they use this term null, which doesn't mean zero. It just means like there's a lack of data in a certain spot in the memory of the computer, and that puts up this null value. You can make Excel spreadsheets do this, for example, and I think that what Leonardo does in investigation and in research and his inquiries is he produces objects that articulate the null of knowledge, not necessarily plug in the zero values of our knowledge. And I think that a lot of times when you read Walter Benjamin's fragments, they have that kind of sensibility to them where they kind of leave you asking questions, not really figuring something out.
Yeah. I also, don't you think too that, like, I was thinking of the thesis on the philosophy of history or on the concept of history, and the way, and this to me is an indication of his genius, is that he is able to see and in like the Paul Klee painting, Angelus Novus, like the, I don't know if you've ever seen the painting, but like Benjamin's account of the painting is amazing. And then you look at the painting, you're like, that's it. Like it's not so, it's very disappointing. And I think like that to me speaks to the side venture thing you're talking about, right? Like he goes to this thing that's on the side, and yet he's able to see something that probably isn't even there for most people, but it is.
Yeah, I think precisely the genius locates something that's not there because it's not there. It's like in literal terms not there, right? It's the actual void of the thing, right? It's the lack in the object that the genius is able to articulate into a form. Yeah, which I then produces this kind of, thoughts that go beyond the limit.
Yeah, that's really good. And so you just mentioned Lacan, and I thought it was really interesting. So I think you're more, or you've said to me, I'm more Freudian than I am Lacanian.
Yeah.
Right?
I think I'm a Lacanian Freudian than I am a Freudian Lacanian.
Right. But in this book, it's really interesting the way you put those two into relationship, right? And I wonder if you could just say something about that, like what for you, because and it's interesting because it's really the Lacan of Seminar 7, I think, that's the important figure in here. I mean, when I read this book, I was thinking it's too bad, and she was, of course, the original editor of it was Mari Rudy, and then I thought it's too bad Mari isn't still alive, because I think like a lot of the things you say about art and sublimation and especially the relationship between Freud and Lacan, I think really it's not surprising that she was initially interested in this book, because it seems to resonate with her thinking quite a bit. but I think she also had this sense of like that it's, and I wonder if you think about this thing is true, that for you, it's the Lacan of Seminar 7, precisely because of this formulation of Das Ding and sublimation, that's really the valuable part of him. And then like that, it's, and he kind of goes away from that, right? I mean, for sure. And maybe, but that's what you want to hold on to, I think.
Yeah. So I know there's among Lacanians, and maybe I've heard you say this quite a bit, of these different periodizations of Lacan. I guess I'm not as invested in those periodizations. I find things valuable in Lacan throughout. You know, like I'm a big Seminar 11 guy, but I'm also a big Seminar 7 guy. It's also not a mistake that in my graduate school education with Ken Reinhardt, those were the two seminars that we really like dug into. In my in the seminar that I took with Ken. So those are very formative in my understanding of Lacan. But it is true that sublimation is dealt with most explicitly and probably the most thoroughly in Seminar 7.
For sure.
And it's in relation to the object. Whereas when you read Freud, sublimation is always in relation to the drive.
Yeah.
The aim of the drive, not necessarily to the object of the drive. And in fact, he even says, it's the ancient people, who really cared about the ancient people who cared about the drive and the aim, and it's really modern people who care about the object and so in that sense,
you quote that's a footnote from the three theories, three essays,
three theories,
right?
Three essays. And I think that so for me, Lacan, I think supplements Freud's theory of sublimation by investigating the drive in relation to the object. And I'm not sure that's quite at the forefront of Lacan's mind there in that seminar, because I know the object is just something that's very central to his thinking all the way throughout.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly there's something in Seminar 7 that deals directly with sublimation in a way that I don't find in a lot of the other seminars.
And in Freud too, right? Like you think that like Lacan adds something for you to Freud's theory, and that is precisely, I mean, it's interesting to me how, I think this was really good, and I haven't even seen our mutual friend, Rick Boothby. I think he's clearly talks about Das Ding in every kind of permutation, but I'm not sure that he's said this, that maybe he has, but the way that you say it's this point of non-meaning within the object, right? Like, I think that's really, that seemed to me really like something that gives us a way to understand like what Lacan can contribute, especially in Seminar 7, to understanding not just genius, but sublimation as well. And also the drive, right? Like that the drive, like what's important for the drive is precisely this point of non-meaning, not the symbolic world of meaning, right?
Yeah. So actually, just before I answer that question, just to say a few words about Mario Rudi, because she was so central to the book. She was, the first editor that really took me seriously, and I owe a lot to Mari. And I know that Seminar 7 and creativity is very important to her and her work. And I only had short interactions with her at the time when the book was going through review, and that was one of the points that she emphasized with me that drew her to the book, was this idea. In her words, she was saying that, I'm kind of like rehabilitating old-fashioned terms, which is sort of like, she kind of sees herself doing that. She told me, like that these old humanist terms that we kind of feel like they have nothing to do with now, genius, creativity, art, and things like that, and how she was sort of like rehabilitating. She sort of saw the project as sort of doing that. So she was very central to the final form of the book. As far as that about my reading of Das Ding, that really comes from paying attention to the Freudian aspect of Lacan's theory of sublimation, as he articulates it through the project Scientific Psychology that Freud tries to work through. And in there, you get this.
Just to be clear, Danny, that's where Lacan gets Das Ding from, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and where he gets that from is this articulation Freud has of the object. The other familiar objects break down into two pieces. One that's a familiar part that we understand, we comprehend it, we relate it back to our experience, and there's always some other thing. Freud just lowercase t. There's just some other thing about the object that escapes our ability to know it fully, and that sort of goes on to other kinds of things in that book.
Yeah.
But Lacan elevates that real idea to the thing with a capital T. There is this object, and the way I always understand it within those terms, which is to say that I understand Das Ding to be this aspect of objects that do not comport to our experiences, that cannot be related back to us. So I guess it's a very Freudian understanding of Das Ding. And I'm not sure other Lacanians see it the same way. Other Lacanians see it more like destructively, and it's the thing that explodes. I'm very much for the symbolic order in the book.
Right.
But every symbolic order has this null value incorporated within it, and the point isn't to explode it, in exit the symbolic order in some weird non
like mystical way, right?
Yeah. But the point is to hold it in place, I think.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that really aligns with how Rick views Das Ding. It's interesting to me that I just want to talk about this capitalization for a minute because it's kind of funny. So you do not when you refer to the thing, you do not, unlike most people and this kind of is proof that you're more on the Freudian side than the Lacanian side, you do not capitalize the thing. But what's interesting about that is one could argue this is just Lacan's mistake, right? Because every noun in German is capitalized, right? So you can't, it's like when people translating Heidegger capitalize being. I'm like, okay, maybe, but you don't there's no textual warrant for that, because you'd also have to capitalize house and car and everything else. If Heidegger ever wrote the word car, I'm not sure he ever wrote the word car in his life, but all those nouns, right? And so I think that I just find that a little interesting kind of parentheses that your book does not, I don't think it ever does capitalize, except unless you're quoting Lacan.
Capitalize. So I tend to not correct other people's sentences. So
probably a good policy, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it does kind of, I just want to focus on that because it speaks to your point, I think, that it's this point within symbolization of the null or the not, right? I think you say not with a K, but just NOT. It's within and not this kind of huge explosive kind of bet. And I think that what I think a lot of Lacanian celebration of Seminar 7 is this kind of Bataille influenced blow everything up, encounter with dust. He even has that chapter. Remember, I think it's on Sod where he says that there's always the possibility of blowing everything up and starting over again, right? And he even theorizes death drive kind of in his theory of death drive in Seminar 7 is a little wacky, I think, right? So I do think I really like the way you turn that emphasis to the small t, right? As this point within the symbolization.
Yeah, I guess it's my reading or understanding. Maybe it's safe to say that Das Ding has a capacity for that kind of explosive, deteriorating kind of reading.
Yeah.
And maybe maybe that's true in actual reality. But I'm more interested in the quotidian aspect of Das Ding. I use a couple of examples from Bruce Fink there of his failure to relate to his patients, which these are not scandalous. These are Bruce Fink writes about this himself.
Yeah.
But it's a mistake to think that we can always approach other people in very familiar terms. like, oh, Todd, you're you're a leftist like I am, so you definitely feel this way about that. And,
Yeah.
and I think that we have this tendency to obliterate this otherness within the other, to turn a deaf ear to it. And I think that what genius does is create objects that somehow articulate that thing. The example from Lacan is macaroni. There's
right.
it's a nothing surrounded by pasta, right?
Right.
And I think that you don't get pasta by just exploding that nothing into nothing, right? Into everything. So I think
you need the material.
Does is, it what it makes us do is it makes us pay attention to what is maybe, in religious terms, sacred about the other thing, by putting some kind of form on it. That the example I use in the book is my experience at the Grand Canyon. Like there's like 3 kinds of reactions to the Grand Canyon you can have. One is you go there and you go, it's a big hole in the ground. That was my dad's reaction to Grand Canyon. And then there's the other, the snooty reaction. Like, I experienced something spiritual at the Grand Canyon that these other RV driving campers just don't get. They're buying their souvenirs. They're not, in tune with the nature of the thing. And then I think the third is where you give up that position, where you get to see what is remarkable about the Grand Canyon is precisely that it is a void, that there is some kind of otherness to it that prevents me from finding some kind of self-satisfaction, some kind of completion to myself, my own leftist green tendencies find completion, that there's something resistant even to that, which makes the Grand Canyon itself. And then I think that may be what Kant is calling the sublime, or, that sort of relationship to something that you kind of can't reincorporate into yourself.
Yeah, I really like the way you link that to Das Ding. I think that's really important. Although I would say there's a fourth reaction to the Grand Canyon, which would be falling in, which would be that's why I've never gone, because that's what I'm terrified. I don't want to fall to my death. So I want to bring up a couple other your own personal examples, because I found them really compelling. So one of them is I too work crossword puzzles compulsively, right? And I thought what you said about the crossword puzzle is a really interesting explanation, both of genius and of the drive. I think it's a really great example, actually. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Like what drew you to it as an example? Like your example is that the crossword puzzle, it like we need a certain level of frustration, that if a crossword puzzle is too easy, we toss it out. If it's too hard, we toss it out, right? So there's has to have a certain, and it's interesting because the times, I don't know if you know this, but the times like Monday, Tuesday, they get increasingly difficult. Monday, Tuesday, right? Wednesday. Yeah. And so Jennifer Friedlander and I used to always say, like, it sucks because Wednesday's too easy. And then Thursday's this weird thing where there's like 2 letters in each box, or it's always a weird thing. But then Friday's too hard. So we always felt like there was never a perfect thing. Since then I don't know her status, but that was about 10 years ago. I now I only find this is going to be interesting because I think I'm a little different on you about this. So so now I like crosswords that are actually too hard for me. Like I like ones if I can solve like 1 in, I don't know, 4, that's pretty good. And so I also like to play, I don't know if you ever play these games like Cinematrix or like Movie Grid, where they have like actors, you got to line them up with certain movies. Again, like I can get maybe 1 in 10, right? Like, and then so that's very few. But your point is, I need more success than that to stay interested, right? Like, so I'm a little curious about that question. And so, first of all, tell me why the crossword puzzle, why it compelled you, and then
I don't have any explanation for why it compelled me. It probably was just the example that came to my mind through free association when I was trying to think about this relationship between for pleasure and end pleasure.
Yeah.
I think that I'm not as my kids would say, I'm not glazing you to say that I think we can articulate genius here in these terms. Like you are a genius and I am not, because I need success. And many times if it was just too hard, that paper just went into the recycling bin. Mm-hmm. But I think that where I sense a note of genius in the way you're describing it, because I think in the way you're describing your relationship to the crossword puzzles, you're more drawn to the failure.
Yeah.
What keeps you going isn't the success that you get, right? It's actually that you can't succeed at it. And it leads to these more drawn out periods of suspension, and those are the parts where, you start to like think about maybe what are all the different possibilities. Like in education, there's such an emphasis on trying to make kids feel successful in their studies. That's what'll retention, graduation, all of that is tied to how successful they feel in the classroom. And so there's always this kind of downward pressure to make things not as difficult. And I think that's the exact opposite. I think what keeps people coming back to class is that they didn't quite get it. There's something there that's under their skin that they don't, I think maybe professors and teachers don't try hard enough to get under the skin of their students. But once you get under the skin of the students, it's not really the success and the knowledge that you impart to them that keeps them going. It's when they sense you have a question, when they sense it's really alive, this kind of theorizing and thinking, and that they can kind of engage in it. And I think that's sort of like what's going on in the crossword puzzle. Yeah. So for ordinary people like me, you have two experiences of crossword puzzles. Either they're too difficult or they're too easy. In any case, you don't want to go on with them. The other thing that I think crossword puzzles illustrate too is that for Freud, the pleasure comes to the drive through the finding of an object, not through having an object.
Yeah.
And once you solve a crossword puzzle, you don't like hold on to it and like
you put it in the recycling bin.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you do. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's always the finding. And if according to the pleasure principle, if there's ever too much difficulty in finding, then it becomes a source of unpleasure and you avoid it. Whereas in sublimation, that unfinding, that failure to find is what starts to draw you into it, because that produces for pleasure.
Yeah, it's God, that's so, I just think what you just said is so smart, but let me just try to riff off it a little bit and ask another question. But so isn't this why, I mean, the crossword puzzle is such a great example, because you wouldn't even show your, like, if I solve a really hard one, I don't show Hillary and go, oh, look what I did. She doesn't care at all, right? Like it's completely about, whereas I think you would agree with me, like with a book, it's a little kind of cheating, right? Because there is, of course, in a lot of forepleasure in the work on the book, right? In the work, but then the problem is that you get all this end play, like the book comes to you, and then a lot of people, you send it out to them, and so, or they buy it and they write you and they're like, wow, maybe after we talk, 1,000 people will read your book and they'll write you and you'll be like bombarded, and that'll be great. But in a way that kind of is cheating on the forepleasure, right? Like it's a way to kind of, that's not what the genius is up to. And I think that's really interesting for what the implications of that are, right?
Yeah, actually, it kind of made me think about how genius could be articulated maybe in two kinds, maybe like lowercase g and uppercase g, or genius as an experience versus genius as a subjectivity. Because like one of my guiding lights throughout writing the book was that I'm not a genius. So I could always just relate to myself negatively to like work out the examples, right? How do I feel about this? Okay, this is not very pleasurable. Like, right. I agree with you that writing the book writing a book. I don't know how it is for someone like you who writes more books than me, but like it's full of a lot of unpleasure.
Sure.
There's just a lot of like frustration, tension, the feeling that you're at the edge of saying something, but you don't quite know what it is you're trying to get at. And then, but my experience with the book is that the time between, so when I turned it into the publisher, I felt a tremendous sense of relief.
Yeah.
Like in the classic Freudian sense of the tension releasing.
Pleasure principle, pure pleasure.
Yeah,
principle, right?
Pure pleasure principle. So not really in the accolades, but just in the completion of the project, right? Yeah. And I think that made me think like, okay, so that's a clear indication I'm not a genius, because I think that a genius would have just keep prolonging this. They would have just literally abandoned the project when they got close to completion and started a new one. We probably know people who are like that. Yeah. And so I think that, but where I think that this idea of the completion started to touch on genius for me was like, when we procrastinate, aren't we precisely trying to avoid end pleasure when we procrastinate? And so maybe there's an experience of genius in the lowercase g for all of us, right? Like people who procrastinate, or when we enjoy failing at something versus succeeding at something, when a side topic brings us. And then I think there are people who that defines them as subjects, like a Walter Benjamin, Leonardo da Vinci. Those are, I would say, to some extent, even Freud, because in Freud's writings, he's never conclusive. He's always
revising, right? Like the project is never done, because he's always challenging his own earlier, right? I mean,
Freud, he's so happy to end the book with, we don't have it all worked out. Psychology, it's just not there yet. Who really knows if something will happen in the future and change, all of our minds, or, he publishes a case study like Dora, which is a complete failure.
Well, but
the reason why we know it's a failure is because he tells us it's a failure.
Isn't that true of every case study, right? Like, isn't that isn't that the greatest thing about, like, people? I love it when critics of Freud are like, all of his cases are failures. But that's the greatness of him, that he doesn't publish the successes, because those would be uninteresting, right? Like, he publishes the failures.
Yeah, it's funny because the critics say that these are failures, as if they've discovered something Freud himself is telling you. Here's a case study that's interesting because it didn't work out.
Yeah, that's so great. It's such a great point. Well, I want to end with the thing that I find really, you've said, like, I'm not a genius, but then you made this distinction between genius, small, big G, and little g. The whole last third of the book really is about, or maybe less than that, but is about this idea of like politics of genius, ethics of genius, right? Like, is there a possibility for a group of geniuses, right? And I think, obviously, you think yes, and you think that there's a sort of political possibility in that, right? Like just because that one might say even that you think the lack of genius has derailed politics up till now, right? Like, because it's so invested in, end pleasure, really, like so many political projects are.
I think probably that what unites the left and the right, and like my son asked me one time, like why is liberal in Europe mean the exact opposite? And I said, well, because in Europe, there's an actual socialist party. There's actually, they don't think socialism is a bad word. So and then Henry said to me, he's like, so actually in America, then we just have like two versions of a capitalist party. And I was like, you got it exactly. We don't have a true left here. But I think to the extent that we have a left, I think what unites it with the right is that they're both invested in this idea of end pleasure.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's a politics of non-geniuses, I think, when it comes to mainstream politics. we're too busy trying to articulate why it all fails, you know. And I think that even
in order to succeed, right? In order to succeed, I mean, that seems like, isn't that your critique of the contemporary political? I mean, even it's a kind of critique of Marx. I mean, you don't mention him, but I think it is, right? Like Marx articulates a vision of ultimate success, and it's a politics of like, no, it's like there is it's the striving, it's the failure, it's that, right? Like that's for you.
I think it's a politics of the process, or the politics of the failure. I think, there's no doubt that we experience failure on some kind of symbolic level. It's inherent to the structure of the symbolic. And I think that people on the right want to tell people those failures are because of this particular group of people. And I think that when we name the immigrant as the reason why everything fails in America, we obliterate what's actually most other about the immigrant. The Das Ding. We claim to know it all about them, and I don't think that takes a genius to act that way, to act like you know it all, And I think that even on the left, when we narrow it down to 1% of the population, but there's still sort of this sense of like, it's those damn CEOs and those damn billionaires that have robbed all of our pleasure, and if we can just eliminate those people, we'll have it all working perfectly.
Yeah, that's really good. I really like the way you form it. What's the opposition between the know-it-all and then the cynic? Is that right? Am I getting the other one right?
There's just the anti-intellectual. Yeah. Then there is the know-it-all, and then there's the genius.
Yeah, I really like that way of dividing things up, and I think that figure of the know-it-all, and I think it's interesting because you can even be a leftist know-it-all when you're like tolerant and like don't want to offend anyone. I mean, that's kind of the know-it-all position, right? Like it's an odd way, but I think according to your theory, that does kind of capture that, I think.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is like there needs to be an element of genius in politics. So the last third of the book is a reflection on group psychology, because there are particular mentions of terminology that appears in group psychology that appear in Freud's theory of genius. That's sort of what brought me to that idea. But I do think group psychology is the great unfinished project of Freud's. I think that's sort of where there's so much fruit to be born from investigating and thinking through Freud's preliminary ideas of.
Do you mean just the book, just the group psychology analysis of ego? Is that
the book? So the book is like 1930. Is it 1929, 1930?
29 maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like the great unfinished project.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because he was thinking about. I mean, Civilization is Discontents is 1930. Future of Illusion is just before that. So he's thinking about. Like, it seems like he's obsessing about groups at this time,
Moses
right?
and monotheism.
Yeah, right. And he just can't, it's like what he can't, I mean, one could say, I think, I'm not sure if this is totally right, but one could say that Lacan kind of picks up this group aspect of Freud's thought as he introduces like the importance of the symbolic order, importance of the big other. And he's really like that he kind of picks up the baton, more or less success. I don't know about the success of it, but it seems like that's at least one thing that people like about Lacan, is that he does take up precisely this aspect of Freud that you say Freud never fully works out.
Yeah, for me in the book, it's Seminar 10 that becomes like pretty prominent because he has this line in there where, well, I don't know exactly what the line is, but this idea that we're all objects A. And that's the universality for all of us, is that we're all objects A. And so I think
in fact, that's how you end the book, isn't it? Like it's like a group of objects A, right? Like
if we all throw our lot into this idea that we're all objects A, this that we are all the knots, the null of the symbolic. It's subjectivity itself. Yeah. I think that may be an element of, I know we both don't like that film, Oppenheimer. Maybe you more totally than I, but it's utopian in the sense that it shows the form of how great work happens, collective work happens, even if it's the destruction of the world, you know. And sometimes I imagine if we got all the great Lacanian thinkers and we put them in some small town in New Mexico and forced them to think about group psychology, we would come up with like the most fantastic version of group politics, that would revolutionize the world. It's like
that's pretty great, man. I love that idea. I mean, that's I know you were very indebted to Frederick Jameson. That's something Frederick Jameson would say, I think. Try to another person who just dearly departed. That you're redeeming even the thing that you don't like by saying, look, there is this utopian potential in even that, right? Like that. I think that's really good. Yeah, but I just thank you so much for talking with me. I thought this is just incredibly illuminating for me about the book, and I hope for other people. And I can't really recommend it highly enough. It's one of the few books I've read. I mean, obviously I've read Hegel and Lacan more than once, but it's one of the few books I've read twice, and I have to say I got even more out of it the second time. So,
well, thank you so much, Todd. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, take care.